Yeah. All right.
Jesus, Doug, you son of a bitch. I hope SteamYard is at least like something that I should be using, like it's like a Linux system or something. But
yeah, fair enough.
hey, you want to get started, but first write and tell Doug to go fuck himself? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Tell him it works.
Yep.
Just
All
promptly write him right now and say it works. And then we'll get started. We're on Zoom with no problems.
Yep. Like right away.
Literally click with audio and it starts. And on SteamYard, I can't even get into an IM to ask help without retrieving my password. It's just like, I like the attitude of that. It's like, do you really want to do this? Maybe you should be a little bit more thoughtful about your online meetings. Zoom's like, it's great, fucking do it. Now we know your DNA and your retina. All right, you ready, man?
Yeah. You want to shoot for like about an hour, or what are you thinking?
I think like I have another thing at 6:30, so I think if we do like 50 minutes, that's awesome.
Yep, perfect. All right.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So I am here talking to Michael Brooks, host of the Michael Brooks Show, co-host of the Majority Report, a new show whose name I'm not entirely sure of on the Jacobin YouTube channel with Anna Kasparian.
Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks.
Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. And most importantly, for this context, the author of an excellent new book coming out on April 24th called Against the Web, a Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. So let's talk about the book, and let's talk about the web. This is a reference to what was, with a hilarious lack of self-awareness, branded as the intellectual dark web. So what's that?
I think that you know, the intellectual dark web is basically a group of guys that started congregating together and going on each other's podcasts and YouTube platforms. Nothing wrong with that, I hasten to add. We all do that. And they really had a huge amount of currency in 2018. So I confess, and I want to just actually not, you know, I'll say up front that I think these particular cast of characters, I primarily focus on Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, to some extent Ben Shapiro, much less so the Weinsteins. And now I would say the Weinsteins are sort of like actually the kind of main carriers of this brand. But they didn't strike me to be as, well, I mean, certainly not as relevant as when I was writing the book. And I think insofar as I could tell, they're ideas that were relevant to me, which are the political ideas, the social ideas, the kind of general just sort of complaints about political correctness or whatever. I think they parallel enough with the main cast that I focused on. So, you know, I noticed somebody, you know, complaining to me that I didn't, you know, how could I have a problem with Eric Weinstein's theory of physics? Totally happy to say that I have no idea what that is. You know, good on him, and you know, jobless. You know, the book is not really focused on that. But in 2000, but at any rate, it's sort of dissipated as a brand. You know,
You even say at the beginning of the book, or at least the last draft I read, that you know, this is in the past, right? That this particular branding exercise was kind of starting to fade away by this point. But the larger interest is that it's a case study in the evolving ways that the right wing is presenting itself, is sort of maybe shifting past certain traditional coalitions and positions and adopting new ways of branding itself and presenting itself. Although, of course, the sort of core concerns that all versions of the right have been about about defending and naturalizing traditional hierarchies are definitely still going to be there. And so it's not so much that this is a book that is about this particular cluster of, well, if you want to be nice about it, thinkers, but it's a book that is about the way that the sort of the right is achieving its current form, taking these guys as a case study, and then looking at what's likely to sort of emerge in future versions of the right, and then also think about how the left is pushing back against it, and maybe how we're doing it wrong, and what we could maybe learn about how to do it right.
Yeah, exactly. I think the book is a template of different types of, let's just say, right-wing arguments. And I'll say, for shorthand, this is another thing that kind of catches people, and I explain more in the book. Obviously, from the perspective of my politics, it's not that I think, all of these guys are the same. As an example, I would imagine that Sam Harris is going to vote for Joe Biden. Where Ben Shapiro will huff and puff and blow his own house down or whatever, but he'll probably vote for Donald Trump, even as he's very concerned about him, or whatever it is. But from the perspective of my politics, these folks are very concerned with justifying some version of capitalism, whether that's more or less regulated. They're very obsessed with taking stories that are culturally, politically in play. I would say in their cases primarily around gender and race, and kind of, and as I say, either naturalizing them or mythologizing them are the two words that I use. And so, yeah, that's really the point of the book. And I think, in some ways, and then this bigger answer, which is this idea of a cosmopolitan socialism. I'm trying to use the word cosmopolitan in a new way that really evokes a deep internationalism. And instead of, the sort of moralistic culture of kind of like liberal tone policing and all this other stuff, which, look, I think we're actually all kind of tired of talking about Vampire Castle stuff, but
Sure.
I mean, yeah, I'm as tired of it as it's still existing.
Right.
This is still a thing that just has an enormous amount of drag, negativity, and damage on the left. And, these folks they were able to open a lot of doors, exploiting that. And I actually think that one of the things that the book points to is I think the answer that I'm sketching out is the answer, some version of the answer, some version of a good, not answer, workable framework for dealing with different variations of the right. But I think, what will be interesting as a little bit more of what kind of Peterson was pointing to is clearly the most relevant, I think, in terms of like the issues around personal meaning and alienation. And that's why I think, even though he is not, I mean, he kind of, I think I would describe his politics as quite overtly right-wing, but he mainly goes and he kind of has the boogeyman of Marx or whatever, which he doesn't know anything about. And then he goes into a very self-help direction. But I do think that the next wave that we're seeing, which is, a lot more compelling and dangerous, is going to be probably more overtly nationalistic arguments.
Yeah.
And so so at any rate, it's let's use these guys as a stand-in to describe and understand different ways of working with the world that don't work. And then let's really look at what would a left that was actually dynamic and appealing and unique, but also universalist, and truly global, what would that look like, but also materially oriented.
Yeah, so I think it's worth getting into the part about cosmopolitanism, especially because when you talk about the the Vampire Castle stuff, I should say, on the off chance that anybody is watching the Zer0 Books YouTube channel who isn't familiar with that, right? That's a classic 2007 essay by the late great Mark Fisher, where he critiques left Twitter, but I think also just sort of like the general pathologies of the contemporary left in terms of moralizing and policing cultural expressions and individual behavior in a way that's very alienated to obviously a lot of the people we're trying to win over. And I think what's most maybe interesting about the last part of the book, where you present this cosmopolitan synthesis, is that a lot of people who might be unsympathetic to the Fisher critique sort of hear that, right? And they say, oh, so like you're saying that like, you only want to appeal to, I don't know, working class white men in the United States or something like that, right? That
exclusively.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why you write a book for Zer0 Books.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. But like they sort of hear that, and what they hear is this sort of bogeyman of like class reductionism, that like, and they sort of hear that as like, we sort of don't care about anybody's perspective outside of this like culturally narrow thing in maybe like Western countries and people who are culturally mainstream and whatever. And I think you do a really good job of laying out that that's not the case, right? That actually what you're advocating is, and that word cosmopolitan is very well chosen, because it's it evokes this, this idea that like goes like way back, right, in the ancient world, or like kind of like the sort of like why people like to live in cities, right? That there's this in Lucy, in the Cosmopolitan Center, right? The people from all kinds of different backgrounds and cultural traditions are mixing together and living together. And there are versions of that vision that's sort of mixed up with a kind of capitalist economic liberalism, but it doesn't have to be, right?
It doesn't have to be, right? And I think that's exactly it. So I think there's a couple of different threads that I want to pick up on and sort of go from weaknesses that hopefully I'm addressing to a model that's just better in general. One of the things that's kind of I've been and this isn't in the book, but I think it fits very nicely, is using this terminology of open versus closed.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of this stuff, the arguments become particularly, I will say, people who are attacking so-called economic reductionism, that is where the most disingenuity is coming from right now.
Mm-hmm.
You can find a very, very, very small amount of actually existing people who have no base in really any kind of political formation, who might say like, and I don't mean cheekily or ironically. I think some people kind of play around with this, like, oh yeah, sure, like I'm totally a fascist or something, when in reality they're kind of saying like, hey, like maybe like Bernie's healthcare policies with like Obama's social, communication, like, something that you can agree or disagree with, but if that's fascism, then we've won and we live in an infinitely safer world. And and you see this with any number of just kind of embarrassing dramas that erupt on the left. Angela Nagel is actually a decent example of like, I in fact did not agree with her immigration piece. I like Kill All Normies, and then it's like,
yeah,
the capacity to critique the piece is great, and then like saying that that's like an act of Nazism or whatever is is just nuts.
Like Angela Nagel is a good example, right? So we both disagreed with her immigration piece. We both did things on it you can find on YouTube, but like Angela Nagel doesn't have any, like, Angela Nagel's positions that I disagree with the most, none of them are to the right of like just like standard like Democratic Party liberalism, right? That like, and like, okay, right, there are things about those positions on immigration, whatever, that you can disagree with and critique for the left. That's great, but like, just to underline and circle the point you made, just because like this is really worth making, right? Like, and this is true, I'm not going to name any other names because like I think that getting lost in drama about personal evaluations of these characters is beside the point, but like,
Sort of the problem, actually.
yeah, it's actually a big part of the problem,
Yeah, sort of the problem.
but
Yeah.
like the people who are the most like demonized about this stuff, like none of them are different in that in that regard, right? None of them have positions that are about anything that are to the right of just like centrist mainstream positions. And like you can disagree with those, but like, you know, I mean, I guess the sort of unexciting punchline of this would be um, that it is actually possible to disagree with a position without equating it to Hitlerism.
I mean, yeah, I mean, honestly,
Like,
basically, but I think, so I think like, but anyways, so I think what happens is, and by the way, it doesn't mean that there isn't, you know, a lot of different, there is some nuance to these arguments for sure. But one of the things that I've noticed is that people will kind of create like a counter caricature. They'll say like, oh, again, you're an economic reductionist and you have this idea in your head of like a white working class that all like, they like Trump, they drink Budweiser, and the only way to appeal to them is to talk about, somehow smuggle universal health care through God and country or whatever. And the real truth is that, first of all, like every other demographic, we're talking about, when we talk about building like a politics that is a mass appeal, one, we're obviously not just talking about the so-called white working class. We're talking about a vast amount of people across all demographics, because the left is not a majority in any of them. And one of the things they'll say too is like, also, hey, that's like, this is your, class, this is your fantasy idea of like what the right working class is, or the working class is. And if you go out and you deal with real people, you'll find out there's plenty of folks who are, they're white, they're working class, but they have long hair. They could be gender fluid. And my point is that is 100% right.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. There's no doubt about it. And in fact, the people that are really, most identified with the Trump coalition in some key ways, particularly as it revolves around xenophobia or social issues, that's going to be the hardest bridge, and maybe an unbridgeable bridge to cross, unless they can be picked off with serious material commitments, because obviously there's red lines in terms of policy. But the point is actually the reverse than what they want to make it, which is that, yes, if you go out into the world, you will find that most human beings from almost every conceivable background have no interest in and no draw to being part of an upper middle class, liberal, in fact, primarily white, but that isn't even the axis I look at it on, sort of, heavily controlled, ritualized, moralistic culture, including many of the folks that are, supposedly the beneficiaries of this sort of, kind of sort of religious supplicant politics. So the point is actually, and this is where it gets really simple, and we're all, I'll expand at the cosmopolitanism in a second, is that an open attitude really actually starts to allow you to be much more thoughtful. And, the simplest version would be that, like, yes, somebody said, hey, I'm on board. I want us to build, I want to do politics with you, but I can't work in a group and won't work in a group that has openly gay people. Well, you know what? That's not going to work. That's not who we are. That's actually so simple and so easy. Now, conversely, maybe people think differently about any number of social issues and social positionality in the privacy of their own homes, family lives, and social networks. Maybe even in ways that we might amongst ourselves have big disagreements on, but that is not utterly irrelevant. If people can accept a certain very basic commitments around the shared material struggles for things like labor, healthcare, housing, and then, the basic legal frameworks for equity and protection for all, that's it. And it's interesting because it really does strip away, because a lot of those conversations really don't come down to policy. They come down to a lot of stuff that folks want to do around speech, around behavior, around tone. And I'm suggesting that not only does that stuff need to be dropped mostly, it actually is, it's unappealing to almost everybody. And it is not a question of doing some sort of fake, well, we got to get out there and, shave our beards and put on suits and ties. That in certain groups, by the way, you should. That can be very helpful. It's more that you actually need to really start to get genuinely comfortable with a multiplicity of ways of being in the world. It actually is a positive lesson on tolerance and the ambiguities of that, because you know what, that actually raises serious and at times like legitimate questions and serious challenges, which I'll get to. I'll go back to you first, but I think part of the answer of the book actually answers some of those contradictions as well, of like, how do you have universal rights and universal aspirations from a multiplicity of sources and backgrounds? And I think, by the way, this is another thing that with the IDW in particular, they were able to make a lot of hay out of. It's less this way now, but people like me who have a profound disgust and contempt with, as an example, Sam Harris's ideas about Islam.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that, I mean, look, there's a totally correct and justifiable notion of we live in pluralistic societies and you shouldn't demonize major parts of the population and you shouldn't speak about them in demeaning and despicable ways. I cop to being a squishy liberal on that type of shit. But the bigger point was never to say, you really don't get it, Islam is actually awesome. Right. It was to say, there is no essential Islam, right? There really is no essential Islam. There is a vastly diverse, complicated set of beliefs, practices, politics, economics, and geographies that form an enormous group of people. And yes, you shouldn't be an asshole about all of them, because it isn't ethical, it isn't wise, and it isn't strategic. But the answer at the end of the day is not to come up with a little cushy counter narrative. It's to engage in the complexity. And I think, it's still, even to this day, I mean, the sort of right can kind of run circles around, some of the sort of liberal tendency to, I have the most maximalist demands when it's in the, a Western context, and then never be able to say anything about even the most basic things when it's in another context. These are really obvious and easy weaknesses to exploit, which there's actually some really robust answers for. Ironically, by becoming more global, more genuinely internationalist, and not just, projecting outward an essentialism that's either negative or positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the Harris example, so that actually takes us to one of the real strengths of the book, which is one of the big threads that's running through it is about how, whether we're talking about more classic forms of the right or these sort of new configurations that the intellectual dark web branding gave us a taste of, that the sort of, core of that position is about, you used this phrase earlier, either naturalizing or mythologizing historically contingent social institutions and hierarchies. So, you and I met at a conference about Jordan Peterson, who's of course the out of that group, he's the great mythologizer. Sam Harris is probably the biggest naturalizer, right? Like he literally believes that that you can derive his sort of particular moral and political commitments from capital S science,
right.
Which, honestly, like all politics aside, right? That like everything that's all the reasons that are actually worth engaging with, refuting Sam Harris aside, like just offends me just like on an intellectual level, because it's so stupid, right? That like it's just obviously you can't do that, right?
There's like a very basic confusion of is and ought.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas what we want to do, right? As people who think that society doesn't have to be like this, right? That like the sort of hierarchies that these guys are celebrated, and as you say, their fixation is often with gender. Although I sort of think that it's almost like there's a bait and switch with some of them, that like that like I think Peterson sort of sucks in these like confused young men by like tapping into some anxieties about gender and sex, and then like uses that to get them to accept like capitalist economic hierarchies.
I actually think, and then obviously, and this is very revealing that you would just have like, it says something about the politics of the group that Shapiro could be part of it, because he's just a doctrinaire talk radio conservative with, who did some kind of pseudo branding. But I think setting him aside, of the ones that aren't just like a traditional conservative talk show host, Peterson is the one who seems to be the most deeply concerned about capitalism as something that is, or markets, or, whatever way he's framing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously what we want to do is historicize these things. And I think that also ties together two of the big threads in the book, which are the one about the ways in which, it's the one about this, intellectual dark web branding exercise, and what that can tell us about the right, and also the one about how the left has responded and, in some cases failed to respond to it. Because if your primary response to somebody like Sam Harris giving this like cartoonish, simplistic read on the last millennium and a half of Muslim history is how dare you say that, I'm very offended, then that's how he wants you to respond, right? Because that's like that's that sound drop you always use on your show, we can't talk about Neanderthal DNA anymore. Like that's what he wants, right? He wants to be engaged with people whose primary response to him is to take offense, so he can adopt this rhetorical posture of like just being this neutral scientist who's calling balls and strikes, and who's being persecuted, by overly emotional respondents. Whereas, the more powerful response is just to say, well, this is wildly inaccurate, right? Because and it's not even just that it's inaccurate. It's like, this is just manifestly unable to explain the things that you're using it to explain. Like, I sometimes get the impression reading Sam Harris that he thinks that the entire explanation for why Al-Qaeda started doing what it was doing at the end of the 20th century is like what it says in the Hadiths.
Oh, yeah. I think so. You're talking about somebody who's writing about really complicated things and has, some, passages from the Hadiths and the Quran, which, look, I would say there's plenty of things. I think Hitchens' phrase, which was funny, paraphrasing, that there's a lot of things in the Abrahamic texts that are not herbivorous. But the idea that, we're only going to talk about a thought experiment, a poll, and a random quote that I'm not even reading in an original language. This is, that this is stuff that actually matters, this complete stripping away of textual reading. It's like, well, whether you like it or not, that's a major part of these traditions. And also on a much more blunt level, the current king of Saudi Arabia, Ben Salman, who, as we all know, despite the best efforts of Jeff Bezos and Bloomberg and Trump and and Zuckerberg and whoever else, and Thomas Friedman, is obviously a thug and a gangster and a vicious, person.
Right.
He immediately upon taking power implemented some reforms in the Saudi system, and he did that as part of a PR campaign for certain sectors of the Western media, and then also to really ruthlessly consolidate and sideline his, domestic threats. Now, now it's what's hilarious with that example is you can start to see how, a theory of Islam as like this deep, profound, unchanging thing because of some books.
Yeah.
I mean, let alone not explaining decades of geopolitics that could lead to a terrorist group like Al Qaeda. It can't even explain how a prince is on maneuver to run a kingdom, which actually which would be the closest approximation of a very essentialist and I would say identitarian actually view of politics that would fit the most with, if you want to have that one size fits all stupid essentialist view of Islam, the kingdom of Saud. Like Iran wouldn't work in a lot of ways. There's many things criticized about Iran, but the Iranian system is infinitely more complicated. There's a lot more going on. Of governments, the Saudi government would in a lot of ways be the closest. And even there, it just cannot track. So the answer, yes, is to complexify. And I think, but anyways, go ahead.
It's not that Islam has a good essence, not a bad essence. It's that Islam
there's no essence,
right?
There's no essence. There's no essence.
And it's and like in a weird way, people like Harris, and actually that's something I'd like you to speak on in a second, because I think one of the most interesting things about the IDW is that one of its members used to be a member of the New Atheists, and then his next branded exercise was getting together with Jordan Peterson, who is kind of a weirdo mystic, and Ben Shapiro, who's literally a fundamentalist.
Right.
So there's an interesting transition there. But one of the things that really strikes me about people like Harris is that in a weird way, they're not, it's like they don't take their atheism seriously, because if you're really an atheist, then you don't, in a weird way, it's like Harris talks about Islam as if the Quran actually was dictated by some celestial being, right? As if this just dropped in outside of history, right? And was an autonomous cause of everything that came after it, rather than saying, yeah, look, these are obviously texts that have all kinds of wonderful and terrible things in them, and what people care about and emphasize and follow and pay attention to in different historical circumstances obviously can't be explained by the text itself, right? You haven't really explained anything when you say, oh, people have, Sam Harris says Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas, right? So it's like, well, where did, okay, let's run with that, right? Where did, why is it that it says this in the Quran? Why is it that this is one of the passages that are taken seriously in certain contexts later, not one of the ones that's interpreted away in certain contexts later, right? It's just, it's such a, it's almost like, they're going through these religious texts sort of in the same spirit of 12-year-old boys, flipping through some novel they had to read in school, to look for obscene passages or something,
I mean, I was never a fan, and it still causes people some consternation, but I'll confess to, I don't have a religion spirituality allergy the way others have. And I think part of that is because I was very lucky to not grow up with religious fundamentalism. So, I'm willing to, I'll give some epistemic positioning to people. If that's something you have to deal with, my deep concern and apologies of any sort of religious fanaticism. I think that some religious and spiritual teachings and are extraordinarily interesting. And I think, as an example, I'm reading "You Must Change Your Life" by Peter Sloterdijk right now. Is kind of interesting German philosopher, and he reworks religion as basically, essentially, it's about practices. and practices, technologies of change, and sort of even reworks and goes back to original Nietzschean Übermensch ideas as a project of self-invention and definition, and actually not political hierarchy, not a leftist solidarity project at all. I mean, probably, more in keeping with like the Olympics or human potential or whatever. So, and I certainly think, again, I'm infinitely more interested in Cornel West's ideas about, Christian ethics and how they relate to our predicament than just sort of 15-year-old, like, I don't believe in God anymore stuff, which honestly, I just think is, I guess what always struck me about the sort of new atheists was, to the extent they were right, which is, of course, there is a problem with of fundamentalism. That's one of our problems. A certain type of literalistic read of texts and self and other as expressed through religion is obviously a problem in human history and in our modern world. But my thing was that you're not going, like, you're basically, you're going to preach to the choir and convince very few with that attitude of just sort of like complete belligerence. And also, you're just missing, the entirety of all of these different subjects of study and things to look at. Now, I know people like Hitchens and Dawkins were like, hey, I don't need to study Santa Claus in order to know it's not real. But honestly, that analogy reveals how stupid and impoverished the view is, because, I'll be provocative. Look, if Santa Claus was actually worshipped for 3,000 or 2,500 years, set into motion a significant part of world history across major swaths of geography, was the conduit upon which monasteries and economies and initial waves of scientific research and scientific repression and some of the first treaties on politics and governance, if that was all enveloped in the word Santa Claus, then you better damn well be interested in Santa Claus. Like, it's just kind of a facile, stupid analogy. Like, and I go back to, the early, I think atheists who've had a much bigger influence on me, either in the infamous Marx phrase, where if you read the whole graph, when he says it's the opium of the masses, it's, especially by Marxist standards, one of the most compassionate graphs he's ever written. Basically, the society is so vicious and so predatory. This is the only zone of temporal relief, right, as we're marching to industrialization. Then, of course, there's, people like a Nietzsche, who obviously, I think this one's pretty well known, of like, yeah, God's dead. That's kind of a problem. And then, the last thing I'll put in, and actually loops back to I think a lot of the problems with the left and thinking about this universalist project with the left is just Gramscian concepts of sort of, to some extent, like, you work with what you have. Like, if you want to have a global movement, let alone a national one, you're going to have to learn to deal with, accept, and respect a fair amount of people's religious beliefs. And fortunately and luckily, there's a lot of countervailing examples of those beliefs being able to be synchronized with good politics. I mean, frankly, I'm much more interested in what Desmond Tutu has to say about the Palestinian rights crisis than Sam Harris.
Right. So and that brings us maybe back to the cosmopolitan synthesis, because I think so earlier we were talking about it in relationship to the Vampire Castle stuff, where maybe part of the idea is that rather than, think about, I think one of the reasons that a lot of people watch and listen to your show is that even though, you're clearly not sort of, living in fear of offending anybody with a joke, that, you, conversely, right, though, you do have this like deep interest in, global perspectives and like sort of educating your audience about sort of interesting revolutionaries from different parts of the world, things like that. And so that I think the sort of contrast, you're maybe going for is, is sort of a kind of approach to, to use the buzzwords, right? Diversity, inclusivity, whatever. That's like a sort of, performative, moralistic thing, that like, oh, look how, right, much I'm doing this, right? Versus an approach that's just, hey, these are problems that everybody's experiencing, and we're going to have to figure it out, together, right? We're all living together, right? In this sort of cosmopolitan, societies, and
a globalized one.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, there is no, the supply chain on our phones, implicates through Apple, mineral conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That isn't woo-woo. That is literally the reality of our technology, our supply chains. We're deeply interdependent.
Yeah, and so we want, so this is something, if we're going to build an alternative, a socialist one, hopefully, that then we're going to have to do it together, right? People from all kinds of backgrounds and perspectives and cultures, religious traditions, go back to, we were talking about a second ago, and you're going to, and if you're going to, you're not going to be able to get everybody to share one comprehensive worldview first and then go from there, right? That's...
And also I would say too, that not only are we not going to be able to do that, and I'll outline what it is we're talking about and what's in the book in a second, but, I actually really want to insist that we should not want to either.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's actually also really important. I think, like, I always think of Amartya Sen's Argumentative Indian, which is a very fun book. And this idea that, or Zizek, I like it, he's like, I want communism with Julian Assange.
Yes.
I like that. I mean, I think that is the sort of, that's the kind of ticket that not only do we not only is a kind of universalist, one size fits all thing just totally impossible for any type of viable left-wing project. In fact, I think it actually advantages other types of politics. It isn't something that we even would want as an end result. And I think, that's the other kind of thing about this open versus closed. I would be very, closed can come in many different ways. I mean, we all know of examples of people who, I mean, the worst cases, they're just closed, and they're closed along very, lines that have plagued us and continue to plague us, whether it's racism or sexism or anti-Semitism or transphobia. I mean, we're very familiar with those and the fight against those on the left. And much more subtly, less perniciously, we'll obviously make that distinction. But in a broad aggregate sense, there is also just, groups where those areas have had some progress on, but then if you don't have, again, the right social capital, the right social etiquette, the right, then you are gone. And, a lot of people can experience the left in this very cult-like absolutist way, which just, again, in addition to being bad in and of itself, is just completely unstrategic. It's not appealing. And, what I wanted to do, and I'll just bring this in really briefly, is Amartya Sen, who is an important liberal philosopher, he had, and has, very strong social aims, not a Marxist, more of a kind of global Rawlsian maybe. But in the 90s, he was really engaged with these Asian values debates. And what's so funny is I think they're very relevant to the modern world because they oddly track so many arguments that we're seeing. So the Asian values debate was this idea put forward by leaders in Singapore and Malaysia in the 1990s. And in the real, in the days where, this is a gap. If you're in your 20s, I think you don't have a sense of this. But if you were a 90s kid, and certainly if you're, above, you have a very clear memory, and I think particularly in some ways the 1990s, of just like, we won, there's a global liberal order, everybody in the world, like, sure, there's some tree huggers that complain, maybe even a couple of terrorists here and there, but at the end of the day, everybody east, west, north, south wants to eat at McDonald's, vote in an election occasionally, and watch Hollywood movies. And here we are. And one of the only real resistance against that not in terms of markets at all. They're great capitalists, but leaders in Malaysia and Singapore would say, like, first of all, fuck you and your human rights standards. One, and this is what you'll hear always, and it's of course completely true, is that you're completely you're hypocritical. You selectively apply them. You don't really, obviously they don't apply when you're talking about Palestinians, anything else. But then at the same time, it's also like, and we have something called Asian values. So we don't valorize the individual in the same way. And we don't think that human rights stop and start with just individual valorization. By the way, I think that there's actually some legitimate terrain here that we need to explore, frankly. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be at all in the version that they pointed to, which was just basically to justify a much more repressive order in terms of political opposition and, and journalistic freedom and things like that. But I actually do wonder sometimes in the kind of extreme edge of liberal thinking as simply just like state recognition of individuality. I actually do think that there's a communitarian dimension of things. So, this stuff actually gets really interesting and there's dynamics that need to be balanced. But at any rate, so basically you had these two arguments in the 90s. You had these, Western people who would say that they're universal human rights and aspirations, and the West found them out first.
Right.
And now we're happily bestowing it to you and the rest of the world. And then you had people like Mahathir in Malaysia saying, screw you, your Western values. We have Confucius. We have different views of, we have Islam. We have other things that center different things. We have Asian values. And Sen came along and said, both of these arguments are actually pretty ridiculous because the Western chauvinist view is nonsense. Like there isn't some unbroken chain between Greece and Thomas Jefferson. Like, oh, yes, of course, there's influence, but then if we're going to acknowledge and look at the influence, then we have to recognize that Greece and Rome were also, African, also in relation to Asia. We already have a global intellectual culture, even in the most whitened ancient times. And then furthermore, so the West didn't just discuss now, and again, he was very careful. He didn't, he wasn't negating, like, yes, certain types of parliamentary democracy absolutely occurred, no doubt. But the broader idea that the concept of human dignity or freedom, or certainly actually, justice and so on, that this was a Western invention was ridiculous. And you could find sources for it, east, west, north, south, anywhere on the planet. And then he turns to the Asian value types and he was like, you can just as easily read Confucius in a way that would, absolutely empower adversarial journalism, talking about your, double dealing and business contracts for your family and friends and so on. And so what he did was, very elegantly say, there are universal aspirations and they express in a multitude of ways. And I'll just say really quickly, I think this is profoundly relevant right now because on certain parts, and this is another very sloppy contradiction you see in the left sometimes, there's these fantasies about a universalist project, but then, oftentimes what's plugged in is not really universalist, which is a big problem, whether that's liberal or even kind of some stuff you hear more on kind of self-professed radical sides. And then of course there's the problem of epistemic closure and the idea that like there can never be sort of mass-based movements because people are so fundamentally far apart because of their identities. Again, I'll keep reiterating, and I think we've actually really shown that this book and this argument takes incredibly serious the notion of global sources and identities. But at the same time, if that is the be-all, end-all, then we're doomed. And we will just be in our iPhones while we go into a feudal future. Because if there is no mass base for a common collective project, the left has not a prayer. And then on the flip side, and this was really, I would say, even though Trump was elected in 2016, the intellectual architecture of a resurgent nationalism, which, yes, a lot of it's bullshit, but there's some truth to it. And if you look at Orban in Turkey, he will actually, in Hungary, he will point to some of the Asian values models for his autocratic move in Hungary, as well as his, anti-Muslim identitarian politics. So you're having this whole other upswing in nationalism, which again, I'm afraid to say, simply condemning it's not going to work. At the same time, of course, it's enormously pernicious and we need to deal with it. But it's happening in the context of the transnational superstructures have really lost their legitimacy and have destroyed themselves, like the European Union.
In particular, kind of response to it that's really not going to work is just telling everybody that they should just not care about particular national identities or, cultural traditions, that like these just shouldn't be part of how they define themselves, right? That's not gonna be effective. But what like in some of the quotes you use from Amartya Sen in the book, right? You talk about he gives these instances of like really old Buddhist texts that that advocate for religious pluralism quite explicitly, and things like this. And again, the point is not that that's the real the true essence of Buddhism or whatever, right? That like the point is that these are all traditions and conceptual languages in which it's possible to think both authoritarian and hierarchical thoughts and democratic and egalitarian ones.
Exactly.
And if you're going to build a global movement for the latter, it's going to be really useful to, for people to sort of think through these issues in their own language, conceptually, and conversely, that it's all for everybody, right? Like maybe one of the last things I could ask you about here as we wrap up is it's a very brief part of the book, but you talk about CLR James.
Yeah. Well, CLR James, just with the idea that he first of all is a really important Trinidadian Marxist writer. He wrote Black Jacobins, which is, please everybody read it. It's one of the kind of seminal treatments of the Haitian Revolution, which, as Zizek said in a conversation with me, and this is what I love, this is kind of the point, that the French Revolution would have no global significance if the Haitian Revolution didn't happen. And I think that is really actually getting to the point. So it isn't like, if we just point to the obvious contradictions of the French Revolution and we just say like, well, because there was still this empire, this racism, this double, then that doesn't matter. Then we're failing. We're being ahistorical. We're not looking at the progression. And then, of course, on the other hand, if we just say like, look at us, we're French, this was so great. Bullshit. The unbelievable, the Haitian Revolution is the most significant event of the Americas, hands down. And the synthesis from theory to guerrilla tactics make the rhetoric of the French Revolution all of a sudden globally relevant, right? And so CLR James at one point was sort of, basically kind of confronted or discussing the idea of, reading Shakespeare and Thackeray and people like that. Like a lot of folks, with certain types of education from the Caribbean, he was probably more, in some respects, like more of a British gentleman than probably like any British person, and extremely literary and unbelievably erudite across a range of fields. And, he said basically like, oh, I'm interested in reading that stuff because I'm human.
Right.
And that has nothing. And again, it's always a process of addition. Sure. There's a reason. His great historical work is about the Haitian Revolution, not only erased from the history books, but literally, Haiti to this day, through primarily U.S. colonial oppression, and I would absolutely use that word colonial, but going back to a couple of years after it liberates itself, the French threaten essentially to, shell it unless they pay off a ransom. That has material consequences with Haiti's debt relationships today. So what James is doing is he's just doing a process of addition and not subtraction. And he's also really saying that in that process of addition, that this is a shared human struggle. And I think we have to maintain that position right now, because we actually do have to have a compelling answer to nationalism. And I think partially where it's compelling is that we allow and encourage and, recognize obviously the nation state isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So it's an argument about the nature of the modern nation state and how it relates to local structures and transnational structures. That's the argument. And so we're going to say we are on the side everywhere of those that are fighting for justice and equity and in their own fights on their own terms. And the linkage is the substance of the goals, not the source of how you're talking about them, not the means at which they're communicated. And so that's this way, that's a way of really synchronizing the universal and the local. And then on the flip side, in response to the nationalism and in response to the endless standpoint epistemology, I think we have to follow C.L.R. James and actually see that there is obviously a class dimension that's, in my view, obviously most significant to history and politics, that drives most of the action, and that's definitionally transnational. And that also, in fact, we do have so many shared bonds and struggles, and that needs to be reflected in the uppermost reaches and and also just in sort of human flourishing, sports, art, culture, whatever. And then obviously also the very basic reality that most people, and there's a lot of gradations in this, and we don't want to draw silly comparisons, but, certainly the global, say, once you've reached a certain level beyond absolutely horrific poverty, which still exists in most of the world because of, these same policy sets, but that, somebody living a kind of roughly middle class life in the States has more in common, just because of that fact, right, with somebody in Egypt than they do with Jeff Bezos. And that's the thing that, and again, I think that's actually really the dialectic. And I think it elegantly answers a lot of things. And then by the time you've actually done this and you're in a conversation about Fatima Mernissi and Cabral, and you're scanning across the globe and you're looking at how workers are organizing, and you're seeing, different ways people are developing different fights for equity and justice in universal terms and in inclusive terms, then you realize that just simply by doing that, you have a infinitely more robust relationship to inclusion and perspectives than you do by actually usually being in an ultra narrow American conversation, which is performative and moralistic and pretty much never get. I mean, the last thing I'll say is the so much, it was hilarious, I'll just do this one time, the energy around Warren of all of that she was supposedly the most woke and all this nonsense. And then the fact that was in the context of not even having a discussion about foreign policy really reveals, that dynamic.
So what I'm hearing is that you hate women?
Held it.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. And of course, like this.
That was C.L.R. James's follow-up to Black Jacobins was "Make me a sandwich."
That's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, and of course, the C.L.R. James point, as he very well knew, right? Like, it goes, that kind of cosmopolitan humanism goes both ways, right? That like, that, Trinidadian, is interested in Shakespeare, and that speaks to him because he's human, and of course, these sort of Buddhist and Confucian texts that Amartya Sen is talking about should be of interest to all of us because we're human,
Right. Exactly.
It's a two-way street, and that's something that's going to I think just that kind of intellectual curiosity, right? What what could be interesting, what could speak to me about this, just because these are universal problems that like different people have grappled with and they might have different contributions to. And then when we move into the terrain of political struggle, one thing that's very, very striking, I mean, even beyond examples as extreme as the frankly bizarre narcissistic relationship of professional managerial left liberals in the United States to the personal saga of Elizabeth Warren, that like, even beyond
Right.
that kind of example, like even when you look at, the discourse of a lot of people who think of themselves as leftists, socialists, and who are very concerned with the niceties of diversity and inclusion, the sort of social mores of it. Really, very often when you look at their sort of political reference points, it's remarkably Anglo-American, right? It's European at best.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it isn't, I think, part of the hesitation also comes too that like there are clearly sectors of people and, in certain types of labor organizing or just like, so like I know people of different generations in New York who grew up around infinitely more just basic human diversity than 99.9% of like, let's just do, the white liberal college graduates. Now, does that equal anti-racist attitudes? Absolutely not. But it also can mean like a base upon which actual relationships are formed and also actual commitments to anti-racism that have to do with day in and day out interaction, which in terms of language, in terms, like, again, it doesn't follow necessarily all of the etiquettes and rituals and tenseness of that, but it has just a significantly greater relationship to like actual human interaction in politics. I'm saying that not to valorize that, but just to really, strike that distinction. And I think you're also right. And about the kind of narrowness of the sources. And it really does, it does go back. I mean, a very concrete way of looking at it is the foreign policy dimension. And again, I'm not, as much as I focus on the world, and I think it's profoundly important, I totally get when somebody's like, hey, trying to figure out how to deal with my medical treatments here. Like I'm not opposed to that stuff. I care about it, but it's not my primary concern. I actually have a lot of respect for that on some, like, I get that is my point. But at the same time, that's where the rubber meets the road in so many of these things, I think, because you're really then starting to interrogate like the global supply chain, and you're really also extending out, serious range of human, empathy. And obviously that's true domestically as well. But I have really noticed, increasingly, again, like that real disconnect. And again, how it could literally elevate, like, again, I mean, it is like the perfect current example that Elizabeth Warren's personal drama is more important than a potential shift in policy to Latin America that might, have very significant implications for labor and death squads and disease outbreaks, and again, and I think it also, yeah. So I think that is actually, the corollary with this stuff. And
Yeah.
it reminds me of, Ralph Leonard, who's a really great writer who I cite in the book, also quoted the founding, I think it's Tractate. I don't remember. It's a Roman, but the line, which is taken as the kind of like origin of anthropology, is that nothing human is alien to me. And what I want to suggest is that I think we all have been trained, and there's some, very important insight in, like, obviously there are vast differences in human experience, and we need to have the humility of recognizing that. And we can't go back to like the totalizing assumptions of grand narratives. And at the same time, that actually should be our goal.
Mm-hmm.
And not just something that we say, well, that could never happen. That can never be a goal. And we only can just sort of like live inside our little tiny boxes and then kind of form small, narrowly constricted social bonds with each other. Because, again, at the end of the day, that approach is just never going to win. It's never, even if it were the right one, which it definitely isn't, in my opinion, it's never going to build a compelling enough, range. And that, also, goes back to the book, which is that, in post 2008 crisis, at the very least, for some people who are confused and hacking through the weeds, the IDW was, having a conversation that, at least spoke to some sort of personal needs and interests. And I think, we have to do that. If we don't do that, we're going to fail.
Yeah. And I think that, going back to, maybe wrapping up on this point,
Yeah.
this sort of, cosmopolitan, socialist vision, presumably, the reason that you want to be interested in struggles that have happened, in other countries, is precisely that, that even though obviously the experiences are very different, the sort of local manifestations are very different, the things that we're fighting for and the forces that we're fighting against are going to be the same, and so if we're serious about that, right, we shouldn't just have reference points that are limited to the most familiar examples of that, right? We should be interested in how people have, succeeded and failed, and as often as not done some of each, in different struggles in different contexts. So at the very end of the book, you talk about the history of the African National Congress and the Freedom Charter, and thought maybe we could kind of leave off on that, because I think that's still probably one of the sort of clearest expressions of the kind of liberatory vision that that left politics anywhere should be aimed at.
Yeah, I mean, the ANC is an incredibly fascinating and important, history, and it still lives with us today. Obviously, I think unfortunately, with a lot of problems in its current iteration. However, I mean, this is, and in a continent with people, again, some extraordinary revolutionary leadership, and people with some ideas about education and strategy, like Cabral and Samara Machel, that are just top rate. I mean, the ANC really does stick out as just this incredible group, both in terms of what it achieved and also the range. I mean, dozens of extraordinary leaders. Also, maybe the most successful. I mean, it broke down in government, having to do, I think, with global economic demands and other issues to some extent. But I mean, look, if we could figure out a way of having an alliance between a Marxist politics and petite bourgeoisie, probably the ANC did it better in its partnership with the trade unions and the South African Communist Party than pretty much any other example I'm aware of. But the Freedom Charter goes back to a very early call, going back, I believe, actually to the 50s, arising out of the Defiance campaign. I have it in the book. I don't have this off the top of my head, but it basically just says, and again, I honestly think this pretty much covers it. I'll just topline it. Mm-hmm. All groups shall have equal rights, period. It goes on to delineate what that means. People have an equal right to use of their language, to develop their own folk culture and customs. All national groups should be protected by laws, so on. The people shall govern. That's a commitment to democracy. The people shall share in the country's wealth. The people and the land shall be shared among those that should work it. All shall be equal before the law. All shall enjoy equal rights. There shall be work and security. The doors of learning and culture shall be opened. There shall be housing, security, and comfort, and then peace and friendship. Funny to me is that how we deliver those things, how people define those things, Sure, there's some range for legitimate argument. I happen to think in the political realm, actually not a huge amount.
Right.
In the private sphere, again, people can choose to live as open or closed lives as they want. It's not our job to police them. But in the political sphere, it seems to me that that about covers it. And we could really greatly and elegantly simplify our politics by following their lead. And it helps that it comes out of the, certainly one of the most extraordinary liberation struggles in human history, that even regardless of what has happened post-liberation, all of its complexity stands the test of time and then some.
I think that's a perfect place to leave off.
Ben, you're the man. It's very fun to have the mic turned this way. All right, brother. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.